Hi, and welcome to today's presentation. Today I'm going to talk about Mitch McConnell's favorite power grab, why it's effective, and how to best blunt it. I'm also wearing a new microphone because several listeners told me it would help, so let's see if this is better. Early last week, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell from Kentucky said that it is highly unlikely he would allow President Joe Biden to fill a Supreme Court vacancy in 2024 if he becomes Senate Majority Leader, which of course would happen if the Republicans pick up seats during the midterm elections. He also said he might not even allow a hearing in 2023 if a seat becomes available then. McConnell's comments aren't super surprising, which is part of the problem. If you recall, in 2016, when Supreme Court Justice Scalia's seat became available, McConnell, who was then the Senate Majority Leader, took the unprecedented step of saying he would prevent President Barack Obama from filling the seat. Now, the Constitution provides that the President shall nominate and, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint judges of the Supreme Court. In legal language, shall is forceful. It's an imperative in the sense that nobody else can do it. We know from documents left by the drafters of the Constitution that the Senate offers advice and consent to pick the president as a check to make sure that the president doesn't go off the rails and, with autocratic motivations, appoint completely inappropriate justices. The idea was that two branches of government would weigh in on the decision, but the president nominates and appoints justices. But McConnell saw a way to exploit this provision by grabbing a power for himself that the Constitution didn't actually confer, which is the power to say, no, this president can't appoint justices. I have the power to stop him. Now, in fact, Scalia's seat wasn't filled until after Donald Trump became president, which means essentially the Republicans stole a Supreme Court seat. Now, 5 years later, McConnell is announcing ahead of time that if the Republicans gain a majority, he would do the same thing. He would be unlikely to let Biden fill the seat. I want to talk about how effectively and efficiently a comment like this can destroy democracy. So legal scholar Mark Tushnet describes McConnell's power grab as constitutional hardball. Constitutional hardball is behavior that isn't technically forbidden by the Constitution, but it subverts the intention of the Constitution. Constitutional hardball is played by people who are trying to permanently rig the game in their favor. This obviously destroys democracy. Constitutional hardball, by its very nature, batters and damages democratic institutions. And it's easy to see why the Republican leadership wants to permanently stack the game in its favor. The Republican Party is having trouble winning national elections because, for one thing, the numbers are shrinking. Their numbers are shrinking. The Republican base is largely white and increasingly catering to white supremacists, but the country is growing more diverse. So in a moment of rare honesty, Republican Senator Mike Lee from Utah said that democracy is not the objective. Democracy is not the objective. In other words, Republicans would benefit from destroying democracy because if all of our democratic institutions work, they're going to lose. So they look for ways to undermine democracy. The Republican Party has also benefited politically from politicizing the Supreme Court. The promise of appointing conservative justices gets their base to the polls. All of this started, by the way, because of the liberal Supreme Court from the 1950s and 1960s that did things like end racial segregation and enforce federal legislation giving rights to minorities. Conservatives have never forgiven that, and they've been on a 50-year campaign to stack the courts with conservative justices. So McConnell's threat not to allow Biden to appoint Supreme Court justices will rally the base and thrill them and give them a reason to vote in the midterms. You could see how McConnell found the wedge here, right? The intent was never for the Senate Majority Leader to be able to say, we're not going to let this president appoint anyone. The idea was for the Senate to be able to veto a bad pick. But McConnell said, what if I just don't give my consent? So the result is that instead of two branches of government weighing in on the decision and working together, which is what the Constitution intended, one branch, actually one person, because all the Republicans do whatever Mitch McConnell says, can torpedo the process. What does this do? It renders government dysfunctional. Now, to quote Harvard professor Stephen Levitsky, who's the co-author of this book, the greatest danger to democracy is the government slipping into dysfunction because this will erode public confidence. When public confidence erodes, people become vulnerable to the appeal of a strong man who promises to get things done. Now, McConnell's threat, which we know he'll carry through on, had a powerful effect. Once he says something like this, his opposition looks weak and ineffective because he's just gone outside the norms, what we call the unspoken rules. What a neat trick, right? Say something outrageous, and by the virtue of your outrageous statement, make your opposition look weak and ineffective. It also riles up the people who then demand that their leaders, in this case the Democrats, respond in kind. This is the kind of response that came from people who are furious at McConnell. You can see this kind of thing on social media. Enough playing nice. No more high road. Gloves off. This leads to what Levitsky and Ziblatt call escalation, which they say never ends well. When both sides engage in constitutional hardball, democratic institutions will weaken more because the democratic institutions are being battered from both sides. See how brilliant McConnell's threat was? Simply uttering the threat undermines public confidence in democracy, which makes people vulnerable to a strong man who can do what the weak Democrats can't do. It's easy to rile people up then and get them willing to overthrow democratic processes. Now, so what do? Well, a better long-term solution lies in what legal scholar David Posen calls anti-hardball reform. Anti-hardball tactics forestall or foreclose tit-for-tat cycles and lower the temperature of political disputes. Anti-hardball tactics do this by responding in ways that blunt the power grabs without putting additional pressure and stress on democratic institutions. They avoid escalation. Put another way, David Posen argues that anti-hardball tactics are good government rules that both sides would adopt if they didn't know the underlying partisan dispute. This isn't to say that the response to comments like McConnell should be passive or mild. On the contrary, the public needs to understand that McConnell is engaging in democracy-undermining behavior. I can pause here to point out another reason McConnell's threat was brilliant. Well, brilliant if your goal is to undermine democracy, so brilliant in an evil genius sort of way. It's hard to respond. It's hard to respond in a soundbite. It's easier to rile people than it is to educate them. It's easier to destroy democracy than it is to preserve it. So the short-term problem is how to counter this dangerous messaging. A long-term solution would be one that depoliticizes the Supreme Court so that, to use President Biden's phrase, the Supreme Court can't be used anymore as a political football. I wrote about this a few days ago in this piece I did for NBC. My sources are in the published piece, so I'll put a link in the notes with this video. So here's an example of anti-hardball reform. Legal scholars Stephen Calabresi and James Lindgren offer this idea. Congress passes legislation allowing for new Supreme Court appointments every 2 years and then transferring justices who have been on the court 18 years into some sort of senior or alternate status. This process of adding justices would stop when a particular number of justices has been reached. After that, replacing justices who have served for 18 years would allow the court to be continually renewed. Of course, this kind of legislation would have to be designed in a manner that comports with Article 3's Good Behavior Clause. This is the clause that says federal judges hold offices during good behavior. Basically, this is the lifetime appointment clause. But there's nothing to say that Congress can't structure the court so that the more senior justices move into a different kind of position. The idea of the Good Behavior Clause is to give the judges job security so that they can do what they think is right and don't have to worry about politics or getting thrown off the court for their views. But a regulation like this would treat all justices the same. Dramatically increasing the number of justices would make it impossible for each judge to hear each case. Instead, the cases would be heard by randomly selected panels, which would make the partisan divides less overpowering. It would take away this winner-take-all dynamic that we have now. there's more conservative justices, therefore the conservatives always win. To qualify as an anti-hardball tactic, the additional justices, of course, would have to appointed in a way that would satisfy the good government rule. For example, by creating non-political or bipartisan selection committees. Packing the court refers to putting lots of justices on the court who are on your own side. What I'm talking about here is expanding the court in a nonpartisan manner. It's obvious, given the behavior that we've seen lately, the current Republican leadership would not go along with a good governance plan because such a plan hurts them. They benefit from politicizing the court. They benefit from battering these democratic institutions. So the Democrats are more likely to want something like this because they've been hurt by these power grabs. Now, Biden has in fact appointed an independent commission of legal scholars, retired judges, and practicing lawyers to research and recommend a plan to reform the courts. Biden himself said that the court must stop acting like a political football. So we can expect the Democrats to get behind a plan like this. After all, McConnell has already stolen one Supreme Court seat, and now he's threatening to steal another. Unfortunately, McConnell's obstructionism, combined with the reluctance of some Democratic members of Congress to end or modify the filibuster, unfortunately means that a good governance solution may have to wait until the Democrats build a larger majority or revise the filibuster, which of course would allow the Democrats, who now have a majority, to pass laws more easily. We can also expect the Supreme Court justices not to like a plan like this. Why? Consider how much power Supreme Court justices have. 1/3 of the government, the judicial branch, is divided 9 ways. Look at how many ways the legislative branch is divided. All those senators and members of the House. The president has a lot of power, over 1/3 of the government, but for no more than 8 years. Justices can sit there for decades. We have had 9 justices since 1869. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, the population then was under 39 million. In 2021, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, the population is more than 332 million. But we have the same number of justices. Now, I don't expect the Supreme Court justices to willingly offer to dilute their own power. Nobody likes to give up power or importance. Well, some of the justices might be okay with this, but some of them I would expect not to be okay. So I concluded my recent NBC piece by saying this. In the long run, Congress can either enact a good governance solution, depoliticizing the Supreme Court, or risk our government slipping further into dysfunction. Thank you for joining me again. I hope this microphone is better, and I hope to see you again next Sunday.